Thank you everyone for joining us. I've got to look up here now. I'm normally at this camera, but this one's not working, so I'm looking here. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is, I guess, our second revived Azure Thames Valley meetup, so thank you for joining us. We've got an exciting evening ahead. So like last time, and as we're going to carry on moving forwards as well, we're going to start off with a little bit of a community slot and some things going on. Then we've got the main event. We've got Alan Eardley joining us to talk about security and compliance, core concepts explained. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A. And then like last time, we'll have some time for discussion as well and talking through some bits and pieces and top of mind thoughts relating to Azure Thames Valley and how we want to build our community together. So as I say, the first slot is going to be all about community and some things that are going on here. So we're going to talk about two things particularly in this lot. Number one is about the Cloud Skills Challenge. If you haven't seen or heard about that already, we'll tell you all about what it is, and it's quite exciting actually. You should definitely take us up on the offer that we're going to give you. And then also just a bit of Microsoft Ignite Roundup, some of the interesting things that have come out of Ignite, and maybe talking a little bit about some of those there as well. So Cloud Skills Challenge. Chris, what on earth are you talking about? What is this Cloud Skills Challenge? This is something where we've partnered with Microsoft to bring this challenge to Azure Thames Valley. So it's effectively, consider it like a competition. We all like a bit of competition, right, and our competitive natures. It started, I think, on the 3rd of March, and you've still got a couple of weeks left. If you haven't started already, there's still time. And it's going to be going until the 28th of March, 11:59 p.m. And effectively, if you've used Microsoft Learn before, consider it basically an extension of Microsoft Learn. So there's a series of modules that we've worked with Microsoft, pre-selected based upon some of the feedback, some of the areas that you've mentioned you're interested in. There is effectively this competition for us as Azure Thames Valley. And what you can do is if you complete 5 modules or more, you get to enter a prize draw. And I know everyone's already read that line thinking, I want to know what the prize is. Tell me what I can win. We will get to it, don't you worry. The prize draw will take place after the deadline. Of course, it wouldn't be fair to do it beforehand, but I have to say that anyway. And it will be myself, Josip, and Alicia who will kind of get in touch and help kind of coordinate that. So there is an incentive to obviously do this. There are prizes at stake. Not just prizes though. Maybe have I gone? No, I need to go to the next page after this. But let's talk the prizes first, because this is the exciting bit, right? I had everyone at the word prizes. First prize is a Surface Go 2. So, you know, for completing just 5 of these modules, you can go and be in with a chance of winning a Surface, which is pretty cool, right? It's a good excuse to go and spend some time learning if you weren't already excited about learning. Second prize, Surface Headphones 2 and a Bit plush toy, as well as the first prize as well. You get a Bit plush toy there as well. And then the third prize is just a Bit plush toy. And if you're wondering what that is, it's one of these guys. There we go. This is a Bit plush toy. So you too can have one of these little Bit plushies as well. So the prize aspect is one aspect of it. There's also the ability to get these exam vouchers as well. So one of the things that we heard last time very clearly is that a lot of people are quite early in their journey of learning Azure and understanding how to kind of learn and grow and skill up there. So when you complete those 5 modules, you'll also get an exam voucher, but you've got to be quick. You've got to be one of the first. I think we've got 20 of these, so be quick. I think we've got already 2 have gone, so well done to those folks that have completed already. All you need to do is get in touch with either Josip, myself, or Alicia. Between us, we'll coordinate, and then what we can do is get the exam voucher sent across to you then as well. That's one of the exam vouchers that you can use for those Microsoft certification exams, so those MCPs as was, and you've got to take that by the 31st of May because they expire by then. But you know what you've got there is potential to win prizes, a free exam voucher, and you get to learn at the same time. So what's not to love about all of that? So the details, it might be a little difficult to see on screen because of the hyperlink, but I'll send it in the chat window once I'm done talking here. aka.ms/ATV for Azure Thames Valley Cloud Skill Challenge. And there's also a terms and conditions link. And again, I'll send all of those in the chat window here as well. But great opportunity to go learn and potentially win some prizes as well. So now that we've covered that aspect, what I'm going to do is also talk about Ignite. So for anyone who maybe hasn't been in the Microsoft kind of ecosystem sphere, however you want to call it, a couple of times a year, Microsoft have a number of different conferences. One of those is Ignite, and it was actually a couple of weeks ago. And a lot of people in the community, for example, have been doing roundups of Ignite. So John Lund, Johnny Chips has been doing some, for example. Sarah Lean has done a bit of a video recap. We'll cover this in a moment, the Book of News. I've done one as well. But there's loads of different areas where you can go and just keep up to date with this content. Loads of people in the community who are doing this type of stuff. I think there were a few quite interesting announcements. We're obviously not going to go line by line through all of this, as exciting as that would be for everyone here. I'm just going to call out a few things that I thought were particularly interesting. One of them actually was around Azure Machine Learning. Some of you may have heard of Azure Arc already. Azure Arc is this, I guess, suite of products really it's becoming, where you can go ahead and run these hybrid workloads, but have the same Azure management plane that you're used to. That is now available for machine learning, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. Not all organizations want to ship all of their data to the cloud necessarily. They might want to go and keep their data on premises, do some machine learning there. So it's quite an interesting scenario there, I thought. Plenty of updates around the data space, including Purview, lots of different integrations, for example, with Synapse, including Azure Cosmos DB. Something that I think was quite interesting as well is the role-based access control for Cosmos DB. You may have seen over the past couple of months with Azure Storage, that has role-based access controls now built in as well. So what you're seeing is this kind of data plane also getting these role-based access controls. It happened with Azure Key Vault as well. I think we talked about that one last time. So that was quite interesting. New data center regions, and if anyone has been in Azure for quite some time already, maybe you've built in a region, for example, that was right at the time, but now new regions have been built, for example. There's now this service called Azure Resource Mover, so you can actually go and move your resources between regions as well, and that's something they've brought out. Azure Communication Services is one that actually quite excites me. If you think about Teams, for example, everyone's familiar with Teams, of course, but the demo that they give at Ignite is definitely worth having a look at. I can't remember the name of the session, but it's about 30 minutes long, I think, or 20 minutes long. And they showcase the idea that imagine I'm like a patient in a healthcare scenario. I need to go and speak with my doctor. I can just go through their web interface, call them, but the doctors on the other end still use Teams and all the tools that they're used to internally. And they have that kind of virtual connection there by using something like Azure Communication Services. So I think that's going to be really nice, especially the world we live in today with COVID and remote working here. What else? There were a few other interesting things. Some upgrades and upgrade assistance relating to .NET for any developers there in .NET. Private Azure Marketplace for anyone who's managing their kind of organizations. As you can see, the list goes on, right? There's just so much, and I can keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. There's just so much that came out at Ignite. There were quite a few interesting things around scale sets and flexible orchestration. So being able to have these different types of virtual machines inside your scale set. You didn't always used to have that luxury, and now that's something that you can do. More, for example, virtual machine sizes, cloud services support has been extended, lots of updates around storage. And this one was quite interesting, actually, I thought, the auto key rotation of customer managed keys. So if you didn't want to use the Microsoft managed encryption for your storage accounts, and you wanted to bring your own keys, you had to go and manage the rotation of those certificates, which, let's face it, not a trivial thing to do. Probably something that's going to give a lot of headaches to people. There's now an auto key rotation feature there, which I thought was a nice welcome update. again, lots and lots of different things, but there's one in particular that I want to get to, which I'm sure a lot of people have been reading about or seeing already here, and that is to do with Microsoft Mesh. There was a really, really great keynote, I think, and I don't know if anyone else got the opportunity, but I was certainly wearing my Oculus Quest and watching the keynote in virtual reality, which was quite surreal. And I did feel like I was the naughty school kids in the keynote because I was waving at people whilst I was in virtual reality and people were waving back, which was kind of fun. But Microsoft Mesh, I thought, was a really awesome set of announcements, especially around the whole VR space, spatial anchors. There were some other things in there as well. Um, but when you think about the world that we're in now with all of these restrictions, the fact that we can't all be in a room together having this meetup right now, something like Microsoft Mesh I thought was actually really powerful. The fact that it's going a step kind of beyond VR and integrating into things like Teams and all these other ways is kind of what it seemed to be when I was looking at it. So it just looked like a very interesting set of updates. So if you haven't had a chance to take a look at that, check that out because I think collaboration is going to get more interesting there for sure. And then there's tons more updates. I won't go through them all now, but various things around security, other aspects there as well. So go and have a quick scan through some of those other community contributors that we mentioned, because they've all done their own kind of recaps and bits and pieces there about what's happened in Ignite. So rather than reading through the whole thing, they condense it and let you know what's going on there. So feel free to kind of put in the chat, let us know what you think some of the cool announcements that came out there and what you're particularly excited about. And maybe we can see if we can get some talks focused around some of that up and coming content there as well. So with that, I think I'm handing over to Alicia, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, thanks, Chris. So hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to Azure Thames Valley Meetup. My name is Alicia Dillon. I'm the Community Marketing Executive at SquaredUp, and along with Chris and Josip, one of the organizers for Azure Thames Valley Meetup Group. If you are willing to present something to the community, or if you happen to know a good speaker who would be willing to contribute, then please go ahead and submit your session via our Sessionize page. I will share all of these links in the chat a little bit later. We also really want to grow our community, so if you know any Thames Valley locals who would be interested in joining our group, then please go ahead and share our website, links to our Meetup, Twitter, and LinkedIn details. Again, I'll pop all of those into the chat for you. And if you happen to know of any local businesses who may want to support us, please point them in our direction. We'd love to have a chat with them. Thank you, and I'm going to hand to Josip now.
Thanks, Alicia. Yes, so I'm working with Alicia as engineering director at SquaredUp, and I've got the privilege to introduce Alan. I'm not sure, unfortunately, I can't see you, so I'm not able to recognize the faces. But if you happen to be in one of our first incarnation of the Azure Thames Valley, which have been held at SquaredUp offices, I'm just being reminded about almost 3 years ago. Not even 3 years ago, we had the privilege to have Alan back then talking about the security as well, and that was absolutely amazing. So I'm really, really pleased we got Alan again today. He's going to talk about security and compliance core concepts explained. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Alan, and I'm going to sit back and relax and enjoy your presentation. Hope
Excellent.
everyone else does.
Thanks, Josip. Yeah, so it's great to be back. So let me just try and share my screen. So used to using Teams now that using something different is always an interesting challenge. There we go, show my screen. So hopefully with that over there, with this over there, and hopefully you can see the right screen. So can you see the screen with the presentation on it? Excellent, right. What a great user group. Well, you get to learn and win prizes as well. I mean, what better way to start an evening to know that you can actually learn and win prizes? That's awesome. So yeah, I think Ignite some awesome things there. And I know Azure, it took up about half of the book of news. So if you haven't had a look, there's a whole other half that Chris didn't whiz through there. So some great things to learn about in there. So let's crack on with this session, shall we? I guess first thing, who am I? So my name's Alan Erdley. I'm a MVP. I also work for a local consultancy in the UK. So I work for CPS, Head of Modern Workplace. I deal with a lot of clients doing a lot of different things. And this session's really come out of, needing to explain things to them so that they understand it and really understand what the core concepts are, what they actually deliver to a business. I'm also the Hat of Grey Hat Beard podcast. I run the Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance user group, which we started up recently. So that's the last Wednesday of every month. So if anything takes your fancy in this session, please check us out. We've got some awesome speakers and awesome sessions coming up, and you'll really get under the hood of some of the security compliance pieces. I also run the London Power Platform user group as well. So what am I going to cover? The problem is the vocabulary, isn't it? What do we actually mean by security and compliance? I'm going to go through hopefully some things that will stick in your mind to explain some of these things, and I'll share the slide deck as well, so you can borrow the slide deck and use it. And some of the benefits of being able to explain these features in what I would like to call normal language. So we're not going to geek out in any of this. We're going to try and understand what some of these things do and why they're good for your organization. So really, let's get down to the problem. What is the problem here? The problem is that when you speak to anybody who really knows this stuff, they're going to use a whole bunch of technology and words that people just kind of go, don't really get that. What does that actually mean to me? What does that mean to me as either as a business stakeholder or as an end user? Even as IT, what does that actually mean to me? If I'm speaking to a compliance officer, they're going to use terms that normal people just don't understand. And the differences between the features are not always obvious. So when you start to talk to Microsoft about things, the features, they kind of blend together, and you kind of use this part with that part, and if you put all three of these together, you get this fandangled new thing that actually does something else. So it can be really hard to actually just pick apart what Microsoft are actually trying to sell us. And let's face it, they're always trying to sell us. I'm not going to talk about licensing here. I'm just going to talk about the features. Licensing, it's very simple. The more you want, the more you pay. If it's got anything to do with intelligence, you're going to pay a lot more. Microsoft, they also use words interchangeably. So they don't like to stick to the same things, do they? So the words they use, the terms they use, the way they describe features and products, they've changed over the years. And obviously they like to change the names of their products, adding the odd space here and there, just throwing in Microsoft 365 instead of Office 365. Yeah, they keep changing them. So it really is quite hard to stay on top of what all of these features actually deliver for us. So let's try and reset it a little bit. So what do we actually mean by, the terms that we're actually using here? So, I've said security and compliance. So what are those? Well, security, protection of computer systems and networks from theft of or damage to their hardware, software, or electronic data, as well as from the disruption or misdirection of the services. So that's really trying to protect our information, our business information from people we don't want getting access to it, from people trying to get, our passwords or interrupt the processes that we use, the misdirection. I get it all the time. Oh, have you clicked on that email? Does it take you to where you think it's going to take you or not? There's lots and lots of different things out there, lots of threats that we're trying to protect our organizations from. So security is really protecting ourselves. Compliance. So that really comes down to conforming to a rule such as a specification, policy, standard, or law. if you work in a highly regulated organization, then you're probably used to compliance. You're probably, used to the compliance team with their big stick trying to make you do exactly what you should be doing, as opposed to letting you, have free reign to do whatever you really want to do. So compliance is really about trying to adhere to the rules that are set out. And importantly, we want to be able to evidence those things as well. So it's really important when we're thinking about compliance that just having the rules written down is important, but being able to prove that we're compliant is actually just as important. So if you're an organization that has certifications like ISO 27001, you have to actually demonstrate it. And if you speak to compliance officers, probably the highlight of their year is when they get audited for these things and actually have to demonstrate that they are compliant and all of the staff and all of the processes are compliant as well. And then we lead nicely into governance, and this is really how we direct the usage of our technology. How do we actually control how things are being used? So this is really putting the control around things. So those definitions, they're not technology specific. They are very much sort of generic definitions of those three words. And I guess that's one of the big things that a lot of people kind of get confused between, compliance and governance and security. And we're really bad at it in the Microsoft ecosystem about kind of chopping and changing which term we're using. And we apply different technologies to different problems and blur the boundaries. So it's nice to really try and define these boundaries. And there's some really good reasons for trying to define these, because Microsoft, in their wisdom, have tried to actually start grouping together the technologies so that actually you go to the compliance admin center, you go to the security admin center, and when you go there, you are expecting to see the tools and technologies that support each of these definitions. Now, I'll be the first to put my hands up. I'm terrible at remembering where things are. So, I hate those exams that I know all of you guys are going to be going for once you've gone through the cloud challenge. When it says, which interface do you go to for this? That's where I start to fall down. And so these definitions try to really help, but there are still some quirks in them when you go into them. But the core concepts are what we're going to try and work to here. So the solution, we've got our definitions. So now, how am I going to try and explain all of this to you? Well, I'm going to use sort of stories, metaphors, and pictures, things that stick in the mind. So, scenarios where we might be using border control or fairgrounds or libraries as metaphors to try and explain what these concepts mean. Hopefully that gives you a way to kind of transfer all of these tools and think, actually, I can remember a story about that. Therefore, it's a little bit easier to actually explain what it is. I've run this a few times. I'm always interested in feedback, questions. That's always really important to me. So if you think that there are better scenarios, better metaphors, please shout, let me know. It's always good to understand other people's ways of explaining these things. I will check between different sections whether there's any conversations, so any questions. So again, please do feel free just to put it into the chat and we can go through it. I'm happy to take questions as we go. So let's start off. Security compliance. So the first thing that we always want to talk about is who are you? Now this kind of backs up a zero trust approach that many organizations, including Microsoft, are taking. And essentially that means we're going to ask this question every time you try and do something. And we're going to try and make sure that actually we're not assuming that we know who you are. We are not going to trust anything. So zero trust basically means we're going to repetitively ask you who you are. Now you might see a flaw in that most users don't want to have to re-enter their password and username all the time. So therefore, we need to be intelligent about how we do this. So when we ask who you are, we're asking it for a reason. And in most of the times, we're asking it because we're trying to work out, are you allowed to do something? That's the key question. The only reason we ask, who are you, is because we want to establish whether you are allowed to do something. So the first thing, who are you? So we want to know, are you who you say you are? You know, how can you prove that to me? So you may have just joined, you're listening to me, you're taking it for granted that the voice that you can hear is Alan Eardley. But how would you prove that? So in most cases, we're going to say, you are who you say you are. How do I prove it? How do you prove that you are who you say you are? So passports are great. You know, we have a passport, and if I hand it to a security guard at the border control, what are they going to do? They're going to first off assume that actually the passport that I hand them is associated to me, which is great. So if it's just a signature, maybe I can replicate that signature. Great. They look at the picture. Is it me? You know, maybe I have to take a hat off, I take glasses off, you know, it can actually check. So what we're then doing, as soon as we start to say we're doing more than just trusting that I've handed you a document and you trust that that document is accurate, we're actually saying, okay, we want additional ways to actually prove that there is a link between you and that document. So at that point, we start using multi-factor authentication. And we're saying, I don't trust that you've handed me a document and it is yours. I actually want to look at the picture in the passport. I want to make sure that it's you. I might ask you a few questions, but we can also then start to use other ways to validate things. So biometric things, fingerprint, eyeball, they're things that are only associated with me. Now, that's great when you have that physical ability to do that, but when you don't have that, then we want to use a device. So you may give me your username and password, but I still want to make sure that actually you are who you say you are, and I have a different way of validating you. So I'm going to ask you to enter in a code from an application that you've previously validated you have access to. So this is where multi-factor authentication really kicks in to allow us to have those additional levels of authentication, which basically means that, I have a daughter, she likes to watch Netflix. She says, can I borrow your password to watch Netflix? Well, if Netflix has multi-factor authentication, no, she can't, because I then have to give her a code from my phone as well. It makes me feel a whole lot better not allowing her to do that, but that's another story. Multi-factor authentication, though, it's the first step. How do we actually make sure that we are looking at the right person and we have validated who they are? So once we've validated them, let's think about it. How do I then make sure that you don't have to do that every single time you log into something? So this is where we get to single sign-on. So if you think about your organization, you have a lot of different systems that you use. So let's think about it as a fairground. So if you think about every single system is a fairground, right? And you go in. So is it something where you just walk in and then you have to go up to each individual fairground and pay for each ride? Or do you pay on the gate, and then once you're through, you're trusted that actually you've already paid to get into the fairground, so therefore you don't have to pay for each ride. Single sign-on is the same sort of concept. Once you've signed in, we trust that that authentication process is robust enough, and therefore every application that is using that same in that same organization can trust that that authentication process is like the front gate of that fairground. So therefore, they don't charge you every time you get onto a ride, and you can actually go wherever you want. That works for single sign-on as well. And this is where, with single sign-on, we're not just talking about applications that are maybe hosted within your Microsoft environment. We're talking about other applications outside of your Microsoft environment that can actually trust that your Azure AD, your authentication process, actually is trustworthy, and therefore is going to actually mean that they don't have to actually go through that authentication process. So single sign-on, think of that as a fairground. Do I pay at the gate, or do I have to pay for each ride? We want to pay at the gate, but we still want to, make sure that's a robust process, but we don't want to then have to force you to pay every time you go on a ride. So assuming that we've authenticated you, we know who you are. Maybe we actually want to check and see, where are you accessing our content from? Are you using a device? Is it a device we trust? Maybe it's been hacked, maybe it's been cracked, maybe it's been jailbroken, maybe actually you've lent it to somebody. And this is where Intune comes in. So Intune allows us to say, well, actually, we don't necessarily want to force you to use a corporate device. We don't want to have to make sure that we have to buy you a device. Maybe it's better for you to be able to use your own device. But actually, we want to be able to trust that the applications that you're using to access our data, to access our services, they are trusted, they are secured, but the rest of it is left open. So you can still hand your iPad to your kids to play with, knowing full well that they can't get into your corporate email and send the boss an email that doesn't maybe make as much sense as it might do if you wrote it. So Intune really gives us that control to say, do we have security on that device? Is it compliant? Do we have a lock screen on it that means that you've got to put a pin in? Do we have the ability to say these different apps are actually controlled? So we've got maybe pins for those particular apps to get into them. Just adding additional layers of security in for our applications and for the device as well. So we can do that and say, actually, our users can still use their own devices. However, we know that our content is secured and that those apps are secured. Now we can also use Intune to actually control those apps and mean that actually the corporate apps, the ones that we as an organization trust, we're not going to allow content to be transferred out of those apps into other apps. So if you think of this as we allow you to store content in Teams, in SharePoint, in OneDrive, but we don't want you to use Dropbox, then we can actually control that and make sure that corporate content from our apps where you have authenticated with our account, so with your corporate account, you can't actually then take that content and move it elsewhere. So it gives us a lot of flexibility to actually manage the devices and allow flexibility of you can bring your own device, very important in this day and age, but you can also use those devices and we trust that we have control over our corporate data without impacting the way you use that device for yourself. So assuming you're using a trusted device or a trusted app and we know who you are, let's think about where are you? Now, this is an interesting one. And I think when I first wrote this set of slides was over a year ago. So we weren't all working remotely. Now it's really different. We are all working remotely. And the journey that we've all been on moving to the cloud has seen us move from, a walled garden approach of, all of our content is behind a firewall, it's behind a big wall, and we trust that whoever walks in our garden, well, they've come through our front door, so therefore we trust them. Implicitly, that zero trust approach that we're now using means, well, actually, you still have to go through all of the checks to get into our garden, but we're not assuming that that wall is protecting it. We've got just a little hedge around our garden now, and therefore we need to track a lot more. So we've got our user, we've got our device, but we also want to check, well, where are you? Are you coming from somewhere that's normal? We might track that actually you tend to log in from the UK, you tend to log in from your hometown or our office network. Maybe there are coffee shops that you tend to go to. It might be slightly different if you actually are logging in from a location that we don't recognize. And this is where we start to see patterns, behavior really kicking in. So when we know how you react, when you suddenly rock up with a Ferrari, we may know that there's something a little wrong there because actually you don't tend to normally turn up in a Ferrari. So therefore, we want to actually look at, well, why are you turning up in a Ferrari as opposed to turning up in your usual car? So this is where we're starting to look at behavior as a pattern. You've logged in from America. You don't usually log in from America. You've logged in from somewhere else that we don't usually recognize. You've logged in using from a different IP address, from a different server that we don't recognize or that we find risky. This is where Microsoft Defender kicks in. So Microsoft Defender for Identity is really looking at what is your normal behavior, and is there an abnormal behavior that's kicking in now that you've logged in from a different location? So we can do a few things with this. We can actually say, well, actually, you've rocked up in your Ferrari. That's not normal. So we might ask for additional authentication from you. We might force you to actually go through that MFA step, even though you've actually come through our front door, you've presented, your fairground ride, you've come to the fairground ride, and we're going, actually, no, we're not quite sure about this. You need to just pay again. So we can do extra things here, which is really useful, because it does mean that, when users click on that little link in that phishing email that transfers their authentication token to a different location, we can actually pick up on that and go, wait a second, there's something not quite right here. Which is very, very powerful, especially with, we all know users are great, aren't they? They do all of those things that we keep telling them not to. So it's great to have this backup that says, even though you've got an authenticated token that says, yes, you have paid to get into our fairground, but your token is red, and today we're giving out blue tokens, so therefore we don't quite trust it. So Microsoft Defender for Identity, it does a few other things as well. So it will send alerts. It allows us to monitor, but it will raise those alerts, and it will flag it pretty quickly as well, so we can actually identify what's going wrong if somebody turns up with the wrong colored token or turns up in a Ferrari. Not that I have anything against Ferraris, by the way. If your organization, you all drive Ferraris, that's great. It'll be a Mini in the picture. So we know who you are, we know what device you're using, we know your location and therefore kind of your behavior. So the last step is, what are you actually trying to access? Is it normal data? Is it data that should be more secured? And this is where we kind of get into more of the sort of traditional permissions, but we can also combine all of these things and say, actually, conditional access, okay, where are you trying to get to? So you've gone through all of those things, but actually you're trying to get to HR data. Okay, we know that's more secure. You're trying to download it. We know that actually that's not allowed. So we can use conditional access to basically put additional rules in that take all of these things into account and say, I want your device to be a compliant corporate device. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to download and use the desktop client to open content from my HR site. I'm going to allow you to access our project site from a personal device, so long as it's a secured app. So we can put quite sophisticated rules in here to actually work out which type of validation we want. And for some things, we can force, right, well, we want to actually re-authenticate every time if we want to. So we can actually put some quite strict controls around how we're forcing you as a user to authenticate, and different levels of control around that as well. So there's some really strong tools that we can use there to actually bring all of this together and say, are you an internal user? Are you a guest user? How do we want to manage your permissions? Tie that together with Intune. Is it a compliant device or not? So there's a lot of tools that we can use there with conditional access. And that kind of brings it all together to say, well, actually, you are allowed. You've got through that front door, and so you're able to get into our solution, into our system, into Office 365, or any other solution that is being authenticated using Azure Active Directory. And it's important to remember that this isn't just talking about Microsoft 365. This is the front door process that we're using for all of our Azure tenant, which includes Microsoft 365, Dynamics, Power Platform. So we're using the same processes, the same tools for all of those. So you've got in, then where do you want to go? And this is where we start to get into more of the sort of the traditional permissions and role-based access. So I always like to think of permissions as just a corridor. You know, everything down that corridor is a set of doors, and inevitably you want to, you know, go sit to a team, you want to converse with a team, you've got to open one of those doors. You've got to go to a SharePoint site or an intranet. Again, it's one of those doors. An application, it's going to have permissions, so therefore there's a door. So some of those doors are going to be firmly locked. Some of them you can just push open. Some of them you might have to knock to get access. Varying levels of permission, you know, and to get through those doors, you basically need to have either a key or the door needs to already be open for you. So when you start to get to the doors where you can't just push them open, we need to think about those permissions that are being granted. And this is where we start to get into entitlements. Now, this is part of Azure Active Directory, and it's a really neat tool that allows you to actually group together permissions. So we can put a bundle of keys together for a group of doors and say, actually, you need to come to us and you need to actually request access. But the nice thing about that is we can publish out a catalog of those keys. We can say, there's an HR bunch of keys over here, there's a project bunch of keys, there's a finance bunch of keys, and we can publish them to different groups of people, both inside our organization and to guest users as well, so to external people. We can go through a whole approval process, so we can actually have the line manager approve, or we can have external people approve that, and then we can have a secondary level, which might be, for example, I might be the line manager of somebody. I do the first level of approval, but I don't actually know, you know, whether they're permitted into that project, for example. So the project manager might then be the second level of approval. So you can have multiple levels of approval to actually gain access to those. But then we've got reviews as well. So we can track how long people have those keys. We can say, okay, we go through that approval process again every month, every 3 months. And if the approval isn't granted, then that access is revoked. So our default is to remove access unless it's granted to continue. So this is a really powerful tool that a lot of organizations don't really use this effectively, but it will actually allow you to both grant permissions, but also to revoke them afterwards. So entitlements is really, how do you actually delegate the keys to the doors when you know that there is a group of them that people need. Great for joiners, movers, leavers. New employee, they joins the finance team, they need this set of keys. They join that project, they need this set of keys. It's a great way to actually manage the keys and how you delegate them to the organization. So the next one, I mean, sharing and collaboration. So it's great for us to be able to give the keys out, but is that enough? Just opening a door, sharing and collaboration these days is a lot more than that. So you probably work with teams. Do you work with external teams where you have guest users coming in? You know, that's a great way where we can use entitlements, but actually we do a lot more than that when it comes to actually sharing content. And so we need to think about how we create those keys for the doors, but also, you know, maybe we're just posting books through the door. You know, we're actually saying, I can share just this one document with you, and you can come in and you can see just that one document without anything else. That level of permissions, we need to actually control that as well. So really being able to control who we share things with based on, you know, which room they're in is really important. So we've got the ability to actually say, for this room, we can actually share and we can invite guests in, or we can block this. We can use sensitivity labels to actually control the rooms themselves, as opposed to trying to manage each individual room individually. We can actually say, for a sensitivity label, we have a internal only, and therefore we can't actually share it with guest users, and we can't share documents in particular with anybody else as well. So very important to think about how we're collaborating, but also it's not just internal, external, it's internal as well. You know, if I put content into the HR room, can I actually share it? Can I invite somebody else into that room? Or do I have to put that document somewhere else for them to see it? It's a very important concept to say, where do we actually draw the line of how we control it? Do we lock the door to the room and then have another room where we actually just takes maybe some of our books and put them there so that other people can come in and see them? It's an important distinction to make between a lockdown room and an open room. So it kind of comes down to, what do you want to look at? So let's assume that we've actually opened up one of our doors. When we open up a door in Office 365, we tend to be looking at a library of some description. You can think of, a team, so within Microsoft Teams or a SharePoint site, as being a library, and it has a document library within it, and within the document library we have lots of documents. So think of it as a library, and then it suddenly becomes clearer. Do I want to have every shelf available to everybody? Well, actually I can control that. I can make folders, change the permissions on folders. Do I want to have maybe an additional back room to my library where I have different permissions? I can actually create a different library, so I can have my default library, but I might have a private library as well that's more locked down. I can have many of these and set them up in different ways with different permissions, but it's still the same concept of, are you allowed to see this? Do you have permissions? Can you look at the books? Can you add books? So this is really where we start to get into really quite granular permissions around what we actually want to be able to do within a SharePoint and Teams environment. So assuming you've got access to a book, what do you want to do with it? Sensitivity labels. I mean, let's face it, James Bond would never have found any secrets unless it actually said top secret on it. And this is what sensitivity labels do. They can do the visual marking on documents, but they can also add a padlock to a book. So they can also mean that actually, rather than me just giving you a book and you saying, I can just open it whenever I want, which is the default. If I send you an email with a document, basically you have a copy of that document. You can open it up whenever you want. If I apply a sensitivity label to it, I can actually make sure that I'm granting you permissions, but you can't share it with anybody else. Or I can say, actually, a group of people can have permissions to it. And basically the way that works is that you actually have to go back and you have to pay at the front door of the fairground. You have to authenticate again. And if you can't authenticate, you can't open it. And essentially we're decrypting when we open it. So if you can't pay, you can't authenticate, then you can't decrypt the document that we're sharing with you. Sensitivity labels do an awful lot of security around that so that we can control who has access to those books. And we also have sensitivity labels against content and data as well. So with Purview, for example, we're actually starting to apply sensitivity labels into data, onto SQL Server, into Azure storage. So sensitivity labels are really starting to actually extend out from where they've traditionally sat within Office 365 and SharePoint. As of Ignite, we can now actually, Purview can actually look at Amazon as well, and it can look at S3 and actually start to label content there as well. So we're looking at actually these sensitivity labels starting to be across the whole organization rather than just on our Office documents. Just want to check, are there any questions at the moment? I don't think I've seen any questions coming. Okay. So assuming that we've got our sensitivity labels, that's great. We can control who can open a document. That travels with the document, and that's really designed for when we're sending those documents out. And when I say out, I mean outside of maybe our department. So if it's an HR document, if we want to share it outside, we might want to control who has access to it within the organization. But also when we're pushing documents out to our partners, to our clients, and we're sending them outside of our perimeter, where we have no control over them. We don't know where they're going to go. They might end up on a USB stick. They might end up on a hard drive that travels the world. We have no control over where they're going to go. Sensitivity labels allow us to control access to it wherever that document sits, because we can control who can decrypt it. Now, if we don't want content to leave our organization, then we want to use data loss prevention. Now, data loss prevention is essentially us putting rules in place that mean that if you create content that contains specific information or is stored in a particular location and you try and share it, so either via the share links in SharePoint, Teams, or you try and email it, then essentially our alarm is going to go off, or the shutters are going to come crashing down, and you'll get a nice polite message, depending on your IT administrator, that says you're not allowed to share this content. This content is restricted and you can't share it externally or email it. It's the last defense, essentially. We don't want to use it, but we put it in place so that content can't leave our organization. Now, we can use all sorts of different rules for this, and we can use these same rules when we're looking at how we put sensitivity labels in as well. And these rules basically look at how we can identify content within our documents or our emails. So we can use standard sensitive information types, as they're called. So whether it's a passport number, a credit card number, there's over 100, 120, 130. They released some new ones at Ignite as well. And these are predefined, standardized patterns that we can look for that are everything from an Australian national insurance number to a UK national insurance number, finance numbers, all sorts of things. But we can also create our own. We can create custom sensitive information types using our own regex expressions. But we can also use things like exact data match, which allows us to actually import data and actually say, well, if I've got an identifier within my organization, which is maybe a client number, which is an 8-digit number, I can use that and say, actually, I also know the names of all my clients. So if I see that 8-digit number and the name of my client, then I know that it's a positive match. Many organizations, regex expressions aren't sufficient enough to be identifying an accurate positive match, because they might have multiple patterns that they're using. So, you know, an 8-digit number being used for your property number and your tenant number, for example, or your client number and your job number. Those will mean that it's very difficult to use automated patterns. So this is where exact data match can come in and go, if I've got this additional information as well, then I can actually have a positive match. And we can use this to say, we're going to apply a data loss prevention policy if we find information in a given location that matches that information. Therefore, we're going to put a policy in place, which is going to mean that either our alarms are going to go off if we've got warnings, or our shutters are going to come crashing down if we're actually blocking things. Microsoft Defender for Office 365. So we always know that actually what we're trying to do is we're trying to protect our users, and we know that they're going to receive emails. And we know that actually those emails, they may very well have some suspect links in them. So we really want to protect that. We want to actually be checking every email that comes in. We want to make sure that every document that comes in doesn't have a virus. And this is what Microsoft Defender for Office 365 does. It stops all of that content coming in. It's like our customs border. And we're going to check, well, in the UK now, we're going to check every single lorry that comes in. And it allows us to actually use the strength of Microsoft and say, actually, Microsoft know more about malicious URLs than we would as an organization. And Defender for Office 365 means that actually we can substitute any link that's in an email and put in a link that goes through Defender, and actually Microsoft can then say, that is a suspicious link, so therefore don't click on it. We can prompt users, we know what they're like, they'll probably click through it anyway, but at least it gives them that level of warning up front, and that way we know that they've actually forced it through to click to it. it will also give us our antivirus, but it will also do some other cool stuff. So, we know users, they're the most dangerous people in our organization because they will click on those links. So we can actually do phishing simulations, attack simulations here, and we can actually say, we're going to construct our own email that is going to be a suspicious email. We send it to our own users, and then we measure who clicks on it, and that way we know who to target about more training. So my organization, our compliance officer takes great relish in actually sending these out on a regular basis. And then he gets very frustrated if anybody actually clicks on anything genuine. So it's a really good training tool to actually get people trained. It helps with your compliance when you're actually saying, we're training people, we're sending these out. We can demonstrate how few people actually click on these things. So brings us on to how we should manage things. So we create content, we need to retain it, and we need to dispose of it. Now, most organizations will have a requirement to retain content. They will also have a requirement to dispose of content. Now, most organizations will not dispose of content. They just simply don't do it. So, it's always interesting when you speak to organizations and they need to actually keep content, because actually it's a really hard thing to do, to say we're going to keep it for a certain amount of time and then we're going to get rid of it. So we can put rules in place, and we can put rules in place with retention policies. And what we can do with that is to say, actually, we want to actually trigger the retention based on the type of content maybe, or the location. But we need to try and make it as easy for users as possible, because actually users are not very good at actually working out, well, this particular document it applies to this retention policy. And if you're in a regulated organization, whether it's public sector, finance, blue light, all of these have very particular retention schedules. I need to keep this type of document for 7 years. I need to keep an HR document for 25 years. I need to keep my building design for 50 years. I need to keep asbestos repairs for 100 years. They're very specific about how long they need to keep it. So we need to really think about, how do we manage that? So we can set up particular rules and say, this is the location for this type of document, and therefore we're going to keep it for that long. We can also automatically apply policies as well. So again, looking at those, the same kind of rules that we were talking about around sensitive information types. We can say, well, we've got an HR number, so we're going to keep it this long. Now, that's all well and good, but actually what we really need to be thinking of is, how do we trigger this? We can keep things if we know that they need to be kept. But actually the more important thing is, is it a sell by date, a display date, or a use by date? How are we triggering the whole process? If we think about it, HR is a really interesting one, because when we put content into SharePoint, well, there's nothing that relates them to the employee's end date when they finish working for our organization. So we need to think about how we push these events in, and we can do that using retention policies, so that we can actually start the countdown and then dispose of things based on an external event. So a really useful way to think about it is your HR system. When you actually trigger somebody leaving your organization, that HR system has an event, and we can actually take that event, push it into Office 365 using a bit of PowerShell to actually then start that countdown, so that we aren't then worrying about, well, is it when the document was modified or created? No, it's when your HR system said that employee left the organization. So we can remove some of the confusion as to sell by, display, use by, because we know actually we've got that external event from our line of business application that manages things. So we've got a lot of capabilities around how we do that. When we dispose of things, we can also have reviews. So again, a lot of organizations, they are a little bit nervous of anything automatically deleting content. And that's the more content that's likely to be deleted, the more they're concerned about it. So we can put disposition reviews in and ask people to check. We can use SharePoint to actually highlight, when those expiry dates will be and have visual markings. There's all sorts of things that we can do to make this process easier and make organizations more comfortable with the countdown to when their content is going to be deleted. It's important to note that for a lot of organizations, the disposition and the evidence of the disposition is really, really important for them. So they can, when they're audited, say, well, look, we have deleted this content because it is over a certain date, and therefore they're complying with things like GDPR. So what's next? Ediscovery. That thing that you couldn't find, and now somebody's made a complaint and you need to actually find all of the content related to that particular conversation. Well, that's what Ediscovery is there for. It's a very, very powerful tool. It means that you can search all of the content in your tenant, your Office 365 tenant, without actually having to think about the permissions that are involved. So from a litigation perspective, really, really important to be able to do that. If you are, dealing with an HR complaint, then it's important to be able to find all of this information. This is where Ediscovery kicks in. It's also important when you have freedom of information requests or you have subject access requests related to GDPR. Ediscovery will allow you to find all of the content within your tenant that is related to a particular set of keywords. So you can do all sorts of really neat searching of your content, and then you can actually export it, and if you need to, you can hand it over to external organizations such as lawyers, police, etc., who can actually use that content. But the other thing that you can do is you can put a hold in place. So you can actually, if you need to, you can put a hold in place, which means that content can't be deleted by the users, and they won't be aware that those holds are in place. So again, it's a very useful tool. So maybe you have to unfortunately get rid of somebody, but you're afraid that they might actually try and delete things. You can put hold in place beforehand. So it's got a lot of different uses, but it's a very highly restricted capability that not even your global admin would be able to use without having additional permissions granted to them. So we've got all of this stuff around content. There's loads of content that we're actually storing, but we do need to monitor all of this. So, every time somebody comes through our fairground gates, they pay their money. We actually do want to know a bit more about what they're doing. So we've got some really great tools to actually track that. So cloud app security is probably the first line of defense for most organizations. What they will do with this is they will start to actually push all of their audit logs into Cloud App Security, and Cloud App Security allows you to aggregate multiple audit logs into one place and actually interrogate them and see all the events that are taking place. So it will have really quite granular logs around all of your interactions. So when you're authenticating with Azure AD, when you're opening a file, downloading a file, it'll have lots of information around the IP addresses that you're coming from, and you can actually narrow down the content that you're searching for very easily and say, well, show me all the other activity from a particular IP address for a particular user, a particular type of activity. So it gives you a really good way to actually narrow down the first level of investigation around things. It also has a lot of capabilities around proactively responding to activities. So you can set up notifications that say, if this activity takes place this number of times within this period of time, notify me. And you can tie it into conditional access and things. So it's got some really, really neat features to actually allow you to respond to the content that's going in. That being said, you do actually need other things as well. So the next step up is Microsoft Defender for Office 365. It's not Office 365, that should be Microsoft 365, apologies. Microsoft 365 Defender really gives you a lot more aggregation of signals coming from other things. So whereas cloud app security is primarily our interactions when we're online interacting with our tenant. We can bring other services into it. What Microsoft 365 Defender gives us is it gives us integration with Endpoint Manager as well, which allows us essentially, in the same way we were talking about Intune, it allows us to actually bring in messages so we can see, oh, well, actually this device, we're using this device, we're getting non-compliance from this device, and we're getting more signals from what's actually happening on that device and activity on that device. But it also combines the cloud app security as well, and also the Defender for identity. So it brings all of that together to give us a more holistic view of all of the activity that's taking place. So we're really starting to, rather than just looking around, our fairground, we're actually looking at a lot more outside of our fairground and people's journey to get into our fairground as well. And then we can take that even further. So then we get up to Azure Sentinel, and Azure Sentinel is, that's pretty much, we can listen to absolutely anything. So where we've got all of our firewalls, all of our on-premise systems, all of our anything where we've got logging taking place, we can pump it all into Sentinel. It's a full SIEM system, so it will allow us to integrate exceptionally well with Microsoft Defender, with 365 Defender, and it also allows us to bring in all of those third-party tools. So where you may have been using Splunk or Syslogs, we can bring any of that information in and use Sentinel instead. Sentinel allows us to actually identify events, incidents, but also to automatically use runbooks. So essentially it's using logic apps to actually carry out activities. So if we see a DDoS attack coming in, well, we can lock down the firewall. We can make those sorts of changes based on activity that's taking place. So it's a very, very powerful tool. It also gives us great insights into, if we've got an intruder and we've detected them, we can see how they're traversing between different devices, different apps, using different machines. So we can see all of that information as well. So what do we really need to do? We need to manage and train people. So the management and the training, I will start with secure score. So I said at the start, we're defining these three terms: the security, the compliance, and the governance. Secure score and compliance score really do give us insights into those first two. They give us a picture of how secure our tenant is based on the licenses that we have available. We can benchmark ourselves against other organizations of similar size, industry, and licensing. It will give us recommendations for what we need to do as well. The other thing that we can do with these is we can actually bring in assessments and say, actually, we want to get cyber essentials. So therefore, what do we need to do? We want ISO 20001, GDPR. What do we need to do to actually have regulatory compliance for those types of regulations? So it gives us essentially a run book for us to work to say, these are the changes that we need to make. These are the tools that we need to implement. And once we do that, our score will go up. You need to carry on doing it. It's not a do it once and then it's done. The security posture of your organization may evolve and change, but we've got lots of capabilities in there that will allow us to be reminded to say, actually, you haven't checked your logs for a while. You haven't been into cloud app security for a while. You need to check all of these incidents and you need to actually manage them. So it's not just about setting up, tick the box, yes, I've done all of that. It's actually about continuous monitoring, continuous evolving of the tools, taking on new features and functionality that get released. You've got to remember all of this stuff is evolving all of the time. So staying on top of it is a, it's not a part-time job, it's a full-time job, staying on top of all of this. So that gives us our sort of benchmark. We can baseline where we are, we can benchmark ourselves against other organizations, and we can measure our progress. Now, just coming back to our users, we need to actually train them. They need to be aware of all of these things. It's the worst thing in the world for users. They don't really want to worry about it too much, but that attack simulation is a really powerful tool. If you can send out a spoof email that you know is actually safe, and then you can measure how many people click on it, that's a really powerful tool with your users to say, you need to be aware of all of the security compliance things. We need to actually manage this. So being able to train them and being able to actually say, you need to be aware of this. You need to be aware of this, because if you don't, then there's going to be ramifications based on our security posture. Then that's really important. So in essence, train your users. They're always the weakest link in all of this stuff. So make sure they understand what you're doing. And with that, I think that's almost on time. So we're going to just summarize. So just to quickly come back to those definitions, security, compliance, two things that you see a lot in terms of the Microsoft stack. As I say, the more you need, the more that's intelligent, the more you will pay for. But most organizations, the business value in terms of what you get for those additional costs is outstanding. And especially if you're an organization who is regulated, then you really need to investigate these tools and these features. And just remember, the zero trust approach to the world is really starting to ask, are you allowed all the time, and making sure that you're checking all of the factors that mean that, you get into the fairground, you've paid your way into the fairground, but do you have a red ticket or blue ticket when you actually turn up at each ride? There's lots of levels that we need to check, and those are all the things that we need to just keep constantly thinking about to make sure that we're actually managing the security. Permissions, don't just allocate them any way they're asked for. Always think about the process. Entitlements gives us that way to request, grant, review, and then revoke or renew those permissions. It's a great way to be able to audit it and to manage those permissions. And it's a great way just to have the ability to delegate it out of IT as well. If you're in an IT department who have to manage the permissions every time, this is a great way to actually alleviate some of that burden on your IT department. Content lifecycle. We create it, we need to trigger a retention process, and then we need to dispose of it. So think about the key thing, what triggers that retention process? How long do you need to keep it? Is it based on the type of content, where the content is stored, or what's in that document? And then, train your users, monitor your users, test them, send that attack simulation, then train them again and make sure they understand. And that monitoring piece, you've got lots of tools available to monitor that piece. And most of the time, you'll be notified by exception that something has happened. So, being able to monitor it on a day-to-day basis and say, actually, we can see all of the events that are taking place and we know that they're all expected. It's a great and satisfying thing to be able to say, yes, we're green across the board, we're happy. When that little amber blip comes up, you know that you need to then reinvest in terms of the training, make sure people are aware that actually, the world is an unsafe place and that they need to be aware of security all of the time. And with that, are there any questions?
There is one in the question bar from Dean Ellaby. He's asked, is it really a hedge around your garden? A lot of organizations seem to have a false sense of security due to them still having a nice big wall around their garden. The issue surely is that, as you say, everyone is sat outside.
Yeah, I think it is. Over the last year, we've seen more organizations move online. COVID has pushed digital transformation further forward in the last year than in the previous 10 years. A lot of organizations may still have the view that they've got a great big wall around everything, but as a consultancy, we're now looking more around the remediation of what people have done in the last year, and to say, actually, you only have a fence. You don't have a wall. You have lots of guest users come in, and it's an eye-opening picture when we show them stats and say, These are how many documents people have shared externally. These are how many guest users you have in your tenants, where they haven't signed any terms of use. They haven't actually got any controls over revoking those permissions. So it's been a transformational year, but there are still a lot of organizations who are going to have an eye-opening and probably eye-watering experience when they actually establish what the state of their security actually is. And this is where, 2 years ago, talking about the compliance and the security piece was quite difficult because people didn't quite get what you could do and why they needed to do it. Now they all get it. They all understand, right, we have opened up our fair ground. We have almost taken down the walls. People can almost jump over those walls. So therefore, we do need that zero trust approach. And we do need to invest in the tools. I think the other thing about that is I've seen organizations, I'm seeing more and more of them actually, highly regulated organizations who are choosing to move online because they get more controls than they get on-prem. And when they've got to the end of life for tools like SharePoint 2013, 2010, it's a no-brainer for them to move online. But regulated industries are looking at it going, there's no point in us staying where we are because these tools give us far more control, far more visibility, and actually make the auditing and the evidence of what we're doing easier. So yeah, there's different levels of organization, different levels of awareness around exactly how strong those perimeter walls are now. Any other questions?
There don't seem to be any other questions. Just a comment from Andy Wilson, just saying some great analogies, Alan. Thank you.
So I will share the slides.
Thank you.
Feel free to use them, and yeah, if you need to explain these things internally, I think it's always a great way to. Stories are a great way to explain things. Stories and pictures, much more memorable than the dry text that we usually come across in this space.
Thank you, Alan. Certainly my preference, more pictures, less words.
Absolutely.
It goes along with my age. But on that note, it certainly, I've got one question, which I always found very interesting, and I'm sure that many people will also find it. So the Azure is very rich ecosystem, and when it comes to, you mentioned the aggregated audit logs, and then eventually being sort of accessible to Azure Sentinel, where you can actually use artificial intelligence to parse and then sort of trigger most important events and find more important events. What is the relationship between Azure Sentinel and Azure Log Analytics?
It's a great question.
I do everything I do with
everything's in log.
Sorry, that was.
So log analytics is essentially the storage space that Sentinel uses, and it uses connectors to ingest content. So there are various connectors, but log analytics, you can actually have a connector that just says, right, I'm going to ingest all of this information from your log analytics into Sentinel, and then Sentinel does the heavy lifting around the analysis and essentially the machine learning to see what you're actually doing. So the log analytics is one of those feeds into Sentinel. If you're interested in Sentinel, sorry, it's a blatant plug, but the next security and compliance user group, we have how to set up Sentinel in 50 minutes as a session. So I'll put that out on Twitter after this as well. But yeah, I mean, it's the log analytics is the tool to use, and then you can ingest it into Sentinel.
Excellent. Thank you, Alan. So that's great. And I'm sorry. So I understand the difference. So essentially the Sentinel sits essentially on top of the log analytics. Is there anything in particular that Sentinel could give, apart from ease of use and machine learning, that I could not potentially achieve through using KQL in log analytics, and maybe even hard work, or maybe my own way? I don't see a reason why should I be doing something that Sentinel gives me. But if I want to do, is there any way I could achieve everything Sentinel gives me through log analytics?
So your log analytics will have one set of information in it, whereas Sentinel will ingest from many, many different sources. So whether it's your on-prem firewall and your Office 365 environment and your Power Platform environment, plus your custom development that you've then pushing everything into log analytics, that's where Sentinel kicks in. It ingests all of the logs from across your organization, as opposed to just being application or platform specific.
Right. So essentially, we're talking multiple data sources that are being collected. Excellent. Thank you, Alan. That's really, really useful.
And maybe just to add in one other thing, Josip, because you mentioned about log analytics compared with Azure Sentinel. One of the other areas I hear a lot is what's the difference between Security Center and Sentinel, because they're both like security tools, right?
Thank you. That was my interesting question as well.
So Security Center, think of it as like almost your reporting tool in terms of how we dealing in terms of our security score and that kind of compass to deal with, how are we tracking in terms of what we're working on and what we expect to see in terms of a baseline and what good looks like. And then you get some other security features kind of integrated through Security Center. But Sentinel, exactly as Alan said, is that event monitoring integration point for all of your different sources. Then you can look from there.
Brilliant.
That's a common one I see as well.
Yeah, there's lots. I think that's part of the problem with all of these different tools, because you've got Azure Secure Score, you've got Office 365 Secure Score, you've got Compliance Score, you've got compliance assessments. There's a lot more detail in each of these different areas, but hopefully you've kind of got maybe some of the right words to use if you're going to go off and look at them and find out a bit more information about them and understand, when you actually need to look for them.
Yes, I could see being a very hard job to figure out which tool to use for uninitiated, at least initially.
Yeah. Any other questions?
No other questions.
No other questions. Well, if you do think of any other questions, then reach out to me on Twitter. As I say, I'll put the slides out, and I'll put another link out to the next security and compliance user group. If you want to know more about this area, then there's certainly a lot more information, a lot more depth to go into.
Thank you, Alan.
Excellent. Thank you, Alan. Let me take the screen back. I think, Alicia, you might need to make me a presenter again here. There we go. Thank you. So let me just share my screen. There we go. Hopefully you can all see the slides again. Cool. So coming up next, as in next time, not tonight, that would be a lot to pack into one night. So next time, April the 20th. So remember, we're going to be the third Tuesday of every month. We have Sarah Lean joining us. So we're continuing the great trend of some amazing speakers joining us. Sarah Lean is one of the cloud advocates at Microsoft. You may know her from the community. We actually saw her blog earlier. That was one of the ones I brought up. She's very active in the community. She's going to be talking all about hybrid Azure management. So think about things like Azure Arc and all of these other technologies that play into that. So again, what we heard from last time was getting a lot of those foundational concepts is good, and we want some of that. We also want to know about some of the new shiny things which are coming as well, and we want to understand about that. So getting a mix of these two here. So hybrid Azure management is going to be next time. Have been chatting with Alicia in the background. We are going to, I think, look again next time about what tool we use. I know we used Teams last time and had some issues with chat. I know we want to make sure it's very interactive, and we'll try again with Teams, I think, next time and try that out, and we'll see how we get on. So I think we had planned to do some networking next, but I'm not sure if we really can with what we're working with here today. So we'll take that away. We'll work on that. So thanks for bearing with us as we keep growing, learning, and evolving, and trying to build up this community here. with that, I don't think there was anything else on this slide to cover really, aside because it was going to lead to networking, wasn't it?
Yes, there's one question that's just come in.
Ah,
Again from Dean Ellaby. This is for you, Alan. A licensing question. You mentioned attack simulation training. Who needs to be licensed for that? All users? And what happens if you send a simulation to all users, but only a percentage are covered by a license for Office 365 Defender 1?
Ooh, good question. Good question. So I believe all users need to be licensed, but the tricky part for a lot of this stuff is that the license isn't actually set up in a way that is granular at user level when it comes to actually deploying some of these things. So I'd need to check on that one specifically to see whether the users would receive that email if they're not licensed. I don't know that off the top of my head, but most of these tools where you've got some users who are licensed, it enables them, and then it's down to basically a trust basis to say, actually, you need to have the right licensing in place. And if Microsoft audit you, then you get into trouble. So there's a lot of the features are tenant level features when they're enabled. That particular question, though, if you pass your contact details on, Dean, then I'll get an answer to you and let you know that.
I know that Dean is active on Twitter, so I'm sure you'll get a tweet, Alan.
feel free, Dean. I'm more than happy to pick that up and make sure I get the right answer for you.
Excellent. So I guess as a recap, next session, April the 20th, going to be with Sarah. Before then, of course, you've got 2 weeks to complete the Cloud Skills Challenge. So we put the links and the details in the chat. Thank you for that, Alicia. So, you know, the countdown is running for you to potentially win a Surface Go or other goodies as well. So go ahead, you know what to do. Go ahead and get your 5 modules at least and learn the rest as well. Maybe something I'll just share as well while we've got a few folks on the call. Something we're toying with the idea of for September timeframe is a series of lightning talks from various community folks rather than having a dedicated speaking slot. So just to spice things up a little, do something new. So we wanted to make sure we gave everyone enough warning because we know not necessarily everyone wants to go and do these things. Some people might. If it's something you've ever wanted to do and you've never felt like you kind of had the courage or the confidence to kind of speak in front of people, we want this to be a safe space for everyone. So if it's something that you want to do, we would love to kind of do what we can to help you take that first step as well. So get in touch. It's absolutely a community for all of this, and we're all here to share and learn from each other. So that will be in the September session. So just keep that in the back of your mind if you've been thinking about that at all. And with that, Josip, Alicia, I don't think there's anything else.
Not from my side.
No, not from us. And certainly we don't want to keep anyone any longer because I'm sure everyone is very keen to jump on the cloud challenge.
Exactly. I think on that excellent guidance there from Josip, Alan, thank you for joining us today. And thank you, everyone. We'll see you next month.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks everyone. Cheers.
Bye.
See you in
Thanks,
next month.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.